Shauna Waters vanished without a trace. Megan Holder's body was found wrapped in burlap. And Warren Hale's name surfaced in whispers too chilling to ignore. 3 lives bound by the sand and silence of Gilgo Beach. What started as a single missing persons report revolved into one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in American true crime history, where each discovery raised more questions than answers, and the killer's identity remained hidden in plain sight. In the early summer of 2010, the warm breeze carried a strange tension across Long Island. Gilgo Beach, known for its stretches of sand and isolation, remained a quiet place where locals fished, jogged, and rarely locked their doors. That quiet was broken when Shauna Waters, a 22-year-old aspiring model from Jersey City, vanished without a trace. Shauna had been living a double life on the surface, a hopeful actress working odd jobs. Underneath, she was using escort websites to pay her bills, meeting clients through encrypted apps and disposable phones. Her mother, Diane, hadn't heard from her in 3 days. She filed a missing persons report, but the response from law enforcement was muted and dismissive. Shauna, they said, was likely off with someone voluntarily. Maybe she'd return on her own. She didn't. Diane refused to believe her daughter had simply walked away. She spent sleepless nights digging through Shauna's social media accounts, message boards, call records, anything that could offer a clue. When she reached out to local news outlets, most turned her down. But one independent reporter agreed to cover her story, and soon. Shauna's face appeared on missing person flyers posted around Oak Beach and surrounding neighborhoods. The pressure, small as it was, prompted local police to revisit the area where Shauna was last seen. A private community behind a locked gate, bordered by thick marshland and scrub pine. In December of that year, a Suffolk County officer was training a cadaver dog near Ocean Parkway. When the dog caught a scent, buried under thick brush, they found skeletal remains wrapped in burlap. For a moment, Diane believed the nightmare might be over, that she would at least have a place to mourn. But dental records showed the body was not Shauna's. Days later, 3 more sets of remains were discovered within a few hundred feet. Each body hidden similarly, each bearing signs of a violent death. All were women. All had worked in sex-related services. None were reported missing in any formal capacity. The media descended, and what had been a quiet local search exploded into a national story. The term lost girls emerged to describe the victims, young women from troubled backgrounds, whose disappearances had gone unnoticed by most. The discovery shocked the community. Locals feared what else might be hiding in the dunes. The police launched a task force, and experts from the FBI were brought in to assist. The serial killer, possibly active for years, was now suspected. But amidst the sudden urgency, Diane noticed something chilling. Her daughter's name still wasn't among the confirmed victims. Shauna remained missing, and no one could explain how the killer managed to operate for so long without being detected. As new bodies emerged from the marshes, the case shifted from tragedy to horror. Diane's search had cracked open something far bigger than anyone imagined. The quiet shores of Gilgo Beach would never feel safe again. The discovery of 4 bodies near Gilgo Beach sent ripples through the entire state. What had started as a missing persons case now looked like the work of a calculating predator. Investigators immediately started combing the area for more evidence, expanding their search beyond the original site. Helicopters scanned the coastline while cadaver dogs were brought back in, and officers in hazmat suits sifted through the dunes foot by foot. In the weeks that followed, the marshes along Ocean Parkway surrendered more secrets. Within a 5-mile stretch, 6 more sets of human remains were discovered. Among them were the dismembered torsos of 2 women, the skull of another, and the remains of a young child. Each victim appeared to have been left deliberately, wrapped or placed to avoid detection. Some had been there for years. Press ran with every grim detail. News outlets broadcast graphics of victim maps and timelines. The phrase, "Long Island serial killer," dominated headlines. Yet despite the attention, the case remained full of contradictions. Forensic experts noticed that not all the bodies fit the same pattern. Some were bound with belts, others showed no signs of restraint. Some were buried, others left in plain sight. The possibility emerged that more than one killer might be involved, or that a single murderer had changed methods over time. Detectives were overwhelmed by the scope of what they were dealing with. It was no longer a simple question of who killed these women, but how long it had been happening, and how many more victims there might be. The identities of several victims were confirmed using DNA and dental records. Megan Holder, a 24-year-old from Pennsylvania. Lindsay DeMarco, 28, from New Jersey. Amber Evans, a mother of 2 from Buffalo. All had worked as escorts. All had gone missing without triggering large-scale searches. The child, heartbreakingly, was believed to be the daughter of one of the victims. Her remains were found just a few yards away from her mother's, raising disturbing questions about whether she had witnessed something before being killed. Public outrage grew as the timeline of the disappearances came into sharper focus. Families of the victims began speaking out, accusing law enforcement of neglecting the cases due to the women's professions. They argued that if the first reports had been taken seriously, more lives might have been saved. The Suffolk County Police Department was forced to address mounting criticism. A formal task force was created, and retired FBI profilers were brought in to construct a behavioral portrait of the killer. The profilers' report painted a chilling picture. A white male in his 30s to 40s, likely intelligent, methodical, and familiar with the area. He may have lived locally or worked jobs that gave him access to remote areas without raising suspicion. He used burner phones, knew how to avoid surveillance, and selected victims he believed no one would miss. That assumption was his first mistake. Because now, even in death, the lost girls were finally being seen, and someone was going to be held responsible. By the spring of 2015, the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders had begun to unravel beneath the weight of its own complexity. Leads had dried up, the task force was shrinking, and internal tensions simmered within the Suffolk County Police Department. Public attention waned, but for the families of the victims, especially those whose daughters were still missing, the silence felt like abandonment. Questions lingered with no resolution. Why were some of the remains dismembered while others were intact? Why were some found miles apart? And what did the placement mean? Most troubling of all was the discovery that critical evidence had either been overlooked or seemingly ignored altogether. Then came an unexpected shakeup. James Burke, the county's police chief, was arrested in a completely unrelated case involving obstruction of justice and assault. As investigators dug deeper into his record, whispers of misconduct surrounding the Gilgo Beach case began to surface. Reports emerged that Burke had deliberately blocked the FBI from participating in the investigation. Rumors suggested he'd been concerned that federal oversight would uncover embarrassing or compromising information, not necessarily related to the murders, but to his own behavior and the department's mishandling of the early casework. This revelation reignited interest in the investigation. The district attorney's office ordered a full review of previously closed files. That's when the 911 call logs from the night Shanna Waters disappeared were re-examined. Previously labeled as unremarkable, one particular call stood out. A young woman, believed to be Shayna, made a frantic call around 4:52 a.m. from within the Oak Beach gated community. Her voice trembled as she said someone was after her. The call lasted 23 minutes, but the transcript had never been included in the original case summary. Even more disturbingly, dispatch records showed multiple patrol units were in the area that morning but never followed up on the call. The reappearance of the lost 911 call sparked outrage. Civil rights groups began pushing for a wider investigation into police conduct during the early days of the case. Meanwhile, a new cold case unit was formed, composed of younger tech-savvy officers with no previous ties to the original investigation. Their focus shifted to digital forensics, phone records, GPS data, and historical location tracking. They uncovered a curious pattern. Several burner phones associated with the victims had connected to cell towers near the same strip of road, not far from the beach, but also dangerously close to several homes of former suspects. One lead involved a property manager who had access to vacation rentals in the area. Another pointed toward a former emergency responder with a troubling history of domestic violence. Both had connections to the location where the phones last pinged. But without DNA, confessions, or surveillance footage, the case remained frustratingly circumstantial. Still, something had shifted. For the first time in years, there was real momentum. Families who had long felt forgotten watched as the investigation was pulled from the shadows and back into the light. The killer, or killers, had managed to disappear into the cracks of a flawed system. Now those cracks were being filled, and the hunt had started again. In 2021, a determined cold case detective named Erin Mallory was assigned to the restructured Gilgo Beach Task Force. Unlike earlier investigators, she approached the case with a fresh perspective, untethered to departmental politics or past failures. She focused on the minutiae: phone records, forgotten property deeds, overlooked witness statements, small pieces of the puzzle that had once seemed insignificant. Her strategy was simple: look where others hadn't. One of the first threads she pulled was a cluster of cell tower pings tied to a small marina in the quiet town of Massapequa. The location had come up before, but was never pursued in detail. It appeared that several burner phones associated with the victims had connected to towers near this spot days before they vanished. That seemed too precise to be coincidence. The marina backed into a cul-de-sac lined with modest homes. One in particular caught Mallory's attention: a weathered two-story house at the very end of Bay Road. It belonged to a man named Warren Hale, a 56-year-old architect with no criminal record, no social media presence, and a long career spent designing coastal homes in the Hamptons. A search into Hale's background revealed that he had worked on several beachfront properties along Ocean Parkway over the past 2 decades. His cell phone records showed gaps that coincided with the time frames of the victims' disappearances, but never enough to build a case. Still, something about the man stood out: a life lived in near-perfect anonymity. Mallory pulled property records and found something even more peculiar. Before Hale had owned the house on Bay Road, it had been briefly listed under a shell corporation, making its ownership history difficult to trace. She also discovered that his name had surfaced once in a confidential tip submitted anonymously in 2012. A note claiming he had a locked room in his home and strange habits, including nightly drives to the beach. That tip had been dismissed at the time for lack of evidence. Now it felt like a missed opportunity. A warrant was obtained for a limited search of Hale's property. When officers and forensic technicians arrived, they found a clean house with little to suggest anything unusual. No weapons, no biological traces, no personal effects belonging to the victims. But cadaver dogs alerted near the edge of the backyard, particularly around an old stone fire pit. Soil samples were taken, and ground-penetrating radar revealed what looked like previous disturbances in the earth, though too old for fresh evidence. Hale, when questioned, claimed ignorance. He said the property had changed hands multiple times before him and suggested the disturbances were from an old septic system that had been removed. Without physical evidence, Hale couldn't be charged. He retained a high-powered attorney and refused further cooperation. Public interest in him as a suspect grew after the search leaked to the media, but officially, the case remained open without arrests. For Mallory, the visit raised more questions than it answered. She was convinced that the man knew more than he admitted, yet the story was stuck again, trapped between suspicion and proof. And the dunes of Gilgo Beach continued to guard their secrets. Time passed, and the shadows over Gilgo Beach remained long. Despite renewed efforts, suspects, and recovered evidence, the case continued to haunt the community. The newly formed task force stayed active, combing through forensic results, cold leads, and digital trails that sometimes sparked hope, but often led to dead ends. Warren Hale remained a person of interest, but without hard evidence, investigators could only watch from a distance. His name faded from headlines, but in private circles, among detectives, families, and citizen sleuths, it lingered like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Meanwhile, the families of the victims kept pressing forward, refusing to let the world forget the names of the women who had been found discarded like trash along the desolate highway. Online communities had taken on a new role in the investigation. Forums, podcasts, and social media groups dedicated to the Gilgo Beach murders grew in number. People from across the country offered theories, timelines, and maps. Some seemed far-fetched, others bordered on obsession. But every so often, one post would spark a new theory or connect 2 dots that had gone unnoticed. Amateur sleuths uncovered records of similar disappearances in other states, creating speculation about whether the killer had traveled or perhaps relocated after the attention intensified. In the spring of 2023, a major development occurred. A box of physical evidence from an unrelated cold case in Atlantic City was being reviewed when technicians discovered something unexpected. a fragment of burlap fabric that matched the material used to wrap several of the Gilgo Beach victims. The discovery raised the possibility that the killer's reach had extended far beyond Long Island. Investigators reopened old case files and began cross-referencing missing persons and unidentified remains in neighboring states. But again, the trail ran cold before anyone could connect it directly to a single individual. Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, no arrests were made. Public interest ebbed and flowed with each new press release, each new theory that promised answers but delivered only more speculation. The case became a symbol of systemic failure, of what happens when the voiceless disappear. And those meant to protect them hesitate because of who they were. The women were labeled as sex workers, addicts, or runaways. That label had allowed their disappearances to be overlooked for far too long. It wasn't until the bodies were found that the world seemed to take notice. But by then, the damage had already been done. Years later, the dunes near Gilgo Beach remain quiet, watched over by families who still visit the sites where their daughters were found. They leave flowers, light candles, and speak their names aloud, refusing to let memory fade. Memorials stand where evidence once lay buried beneath sand and scrub. The case is still technically open, unsolved, unresolved, and unfinished. The killer, if alive, has never been publicly identified. For those who followed the story, there's an eerie sense that the truth is still out there, just beyond reach, buried like the girls were, waiting for someone to finally dig deep enough